Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Today's session is called Looking Back, Moving Forward, Taking Action Towards Reconciliation. Earlier this year, the federal government announced the decision to recognize September 30th as a national statutory holiday, Orange Shirt Day. This is a day to commemorate the lasting effects of residential schools and reflect on the legacy they left behind. Reconciliation is the essential next step for Canada to move forward by rebuilding and revitalizing the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. To honor Orange Shirt Day, Brad Spence from Eco-Canada will explore the true meaning of reconciliation, the purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the actions we are called to take, both within our organizations and as individuals. My name is Emily Peden, and I'm going to moderate today's webinar. I have a few housekeeping points to ensure that we can all enjoy this session effectively. All participants are muted, so please check your audio settings to ensure that you can hear us properly. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please use the chat box and select questions for staff, and I will do all that I can to resolve the issue. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on demand to you within the next 24 hours. Everyone who registered for the webinar will receive an email with a link to the video. Any questions that you have about the presentation or today's topic can be submitted through the chat box selecting questions for staff. We will have dedicated time after the presentation to answer any questions from the audience. Finally, we really want to know what you think about our webinars and how we can keep improving. You will be sent a short survey after the webinar ends. Please let us know what you think or if you have any comments or suggestions about how we can improve. Eco-Canada is the steward for the Canadian environmental workforce across all industries. We champion the end-to-end career of an environmental professional. We not only train and certify professionals, but also help identify and address labor market gaps. Our efforts promote and drive responsible, sustainable economic growth to ensure that environmental care and best practice is a priority. I would like to welcome today's speaker, Brad Spence. Brad Spence is a proud member of the Saddle Lake First Nation and is proud to be a traditional knowledge keeper for his community. Brad has over 18 years of experience working in stakeholder and Indigenous relations in the oil and gas and not-for-profit sectors. Brad joined the Eco-Canada team in 2019 as the Indigenous and Community Relations Specialist, where he's currently working to support Eco-Canada, building relationships with Indigenous peoples, businesses, communities, and governments across Canada. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brad, and I will pass things over to you.
Thank you, Emily, for the kind introduction. Welcome everyone. Danse okay danadada ambo stitch. My name is Brad Spence. I am, as you heard, from Saddle Lake Cree First Nation up in northern Alberta. I'm married down here in Siksika, and I'm adopted out in North America on Turtle Island on about 18 different reserves. I have an extended family of about 3,000 to 5,000 people. I'm on the cultural trail, the powwow trail, and the political trail. Having said that, before I get started, I just wanted to let you know that these are what I'm about to share today. These are my teachings, my learnings that I've gained through my experiences and perspectives. None of this presentation is focused on any one community or individual, but as Indigenous as a whole. I do not mean to offend anyone, and I apologize if I do. I always try to do things in a respectful manner. So with that, I'd like to kind of review our agenda for today. I'd always start off by doing a land acknowledgement, an elder's message, setting the tone. We'll talk about the history, the last 154 years. So we'll talk about some oppressive legislation, epistemicide, and the traumatic effects it has had on Indigenous people. And then we could get into what is reconciliation. And then we'll talk about the reconciliation action. So with that, I'd always like to start off by acknowledging what an honor and privilege it is to live, work, and play within the traditional territories of all Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast, including all First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. I'm coming from you here in Calgary, which is Mohkinstsis. This is predominantly Blackfoot Confederacy territory. The Blackfoot Confederacy territory is made up of Siksika, Piikani, and the largest reserve in Canada, the Kainai or the Bloods First Nation. We are also neighbors to the Tsuut'ina First Nation, which is a Dene Nation. We like to say Calgary is the biggest suburb of Tsuut'ina, and we also are home to the Eahe Nakota or the Nakota peoples out in Morley. They are comprised of the Chiniki, Wesley, and Bearpaw First Nations. And we are also on Métis Zone 3 territory. With that, I'd like to acknowledge that many First Nations live in what we know as North America. We know it as Turtle Island in our creation stories or our origins stories, our legends. The First Nations lived and survived in this territory for thousands of years, from time immemorial. First Nations believe we've been there since time immemorial, and that each nation has its own cultural worldview, language, traditional teachings and histories, and a special and unique connection with the culture and the land. And just a food for thought, there were 60 footprints recently found in New Mexico that dated back to over 2,300 years ago. The land bridge theory was dated back only 2,000 years ago. It brings more credibility to our creation stories and legends or our views. And I just wanted to reiterate that we are the First Nation peoples of Turtle Island. We are the first people. Now, I want to welcome you today to the inaugural National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Since 2013, September 30th has been known as Orange Shirt Day, a day to recognize the tragic history and long-standing effects of residential schools. The Government of Canada fulfills their call to action number 80, where they were asked where the federal government was asked in collaboration with Indigenous peoples to establish a statutory holiday, a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, to honor their survivors, their families, their communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history of the legacy of residential schools remain a vital component of today's reconciliation process. Now, before we start, I always like setting the tone. And our elders always start with the message, and everything is connected. Our languages, our culture, our prayer. It is who we are as Indigenous people. For today's presentation, we always set the tone of truth, peace, harmony, and reconciliation. We want to share our shared history and our past, but we also want you to understand the current realities and how the past affects our current realities, and how we are in this together, that we are all treaty people. We have to move forward together to have a harmonious future. Now, before we start, I want you to think about reconciliation. Reconciliation is recognizing a harm that was done, and that we're in this together. Throughout this presentation, I want you to think, what does reconciliation mean to you? To do that, we have to look back at our shared history. It's not to shame or to blame. It is to educate and bring the truth and awareness to the forefront so we could have that honest relationship moving forward. So today, I'm going to talk about our 154 years of history with the Canadian government. It was July 1st, 1867, officially when Canada recognized the birthday, but the relationship with Indigenous people has gone on more than those 154 years. So the first one that I want to talk about is the doctrine of discovery, or terra nullius. Now, terra nullius is based on a European understanding of property. It emanates from a series of papal bulls, formal statements from the Pope, and extensions originating in the 1400s. Discovery was used as a legal and moral justification for colonial disposition of sovereign Indigenous nations, including First Nations, in what we now know as Canada. The intent of the doctrine of discovery was provided a framework for Christian explorers in the name of their sovereign to lay claim to territories uninhabited by Christians. If the lands were vacant, then they could be defined as discovered and sovereignty claimed. Terra nullius is that legal term used to describe that the belief that the lands unoccupied by Christians were empty and therefore open to appropriation and colonization. It ignores the complex and diverse ways and the respective Indigenous peoples that established their rights to the land and asserted their superiority of Christian worldview over Indigenous worldviews. And thus began the centuries of cultural genocide. To Indigenous people, we refer this as a domination code. Now, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was issued by the British at the end of the French and Indian War to appease the Indigenous peoples by checking the encroachment of European settlers onto their lands. It created a boundary known as a proclamation line, separating British colonies on the Atlantic coast from the American Indians' lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. In centuries since the proclamation, has become one of the cornerstones of our Indigenous laws between the Indigenous people and the government in Canada. This was really set out to show it was a nation-to-nation relationship, how we were going to work together, how it was supposed to be done in a spirit of peace and friendship. It was the important first step towards the recognition of existing Aboriginal rights and title, including the right to self-determination. Now, to me, the Indian Act, and again, this is just my opinion, is the most racist piece of Canadian legislation we have. The Indian Act is the principal statute through which a federal government administers in Indian status, local First Nation governments, and management of reserve lands and communal monies. The Indian Act only pertains to First Nation peoples, not the Inuit and not the Métis. Under Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister, the intent was to remove Indigenous peoples from their land, gain access to the natural resources, and open up the country for settlers, and to construct a railway from Upper Canada to the Pacific Ocean. The great aim of the legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. And that is a quote from Sir John A. Macdonald in 1887 in regards to the Indian Act. The Indian Act denied women status, introduced residential schools, created reserves. They took our Indigenous names away and replaced it with European names. They restricted First Nation people from leaving the reserves, and we needed permission. So a pass system was put in place, and they enforced enfranchisement. If a person went to war for the government of Canada, they were enfranchised. They returned enfranchised. If a woman married off the reserve, they were enfranchised. They did away with our culture. They made it illegal to practice our ceremonies. They took our languages away. And for us, we weren't even allowed to get legal counsel or try dispute any of this or fight back because it was illegal for us to obtain any legal counsel until 1960, which wasn't that long ago. Now, treaties are very complex, and I'm not going to go into great deal with this. Treaties are agreements that are made between the government of Canada, Indigenous groups, and often provinces and territories that define ongoing rights and obligations on all sides. And this is where the term "we are all treaty people" comes in. I know my treaty rights. Do you know yours? These agreements set out continuing treaty rights and benefits for each group. Treaty rights and Indigenous rights are recognized and reaffirmed in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution Act of 1982 and are also key parts of UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which the Government of Canada has committed to adopt. Treaties with Indigenous peoples include historical treaties with First Nation and modern-day treaties, also called comprehensive land claim agreements with Indigenous groups. The 60 scoops, Canada residential school system. I'm sure this is the main focus of today, is to understand, to know the truth of Canada's residential schools legacy here in Canada. The residential schools for Indigenous children started in the 1880s with the explicit goal of isolation of family and westernized children. It's through the policy of assimilation. Although the first school started in the 1880s, it was in the 1830s where they started experimenting with residential schools and the practices. They just became into official in the 1880s. The last school closed in 1996 in Saskatchewan. These churches were run, 60% of them, by the Catholic Church, but they were run on behalf of the state or the government of Canada, and it was mandatory attendance and labor requirements. We were severely punished for trying to speak our language, be who we are. The first thing that happened in residential schools as you walked in is that they cut your braid, they took your hair, and to us Indigenous people, that is who we are, that is our strength, that is our identity, that is our power, our spirituality, our connection is braided in the same way as a braid of sweetgrass. Everything's intertwined and connected. But that was the first thing that happened when you went into residential school. We were severely punished from then on if it was either sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, cultural abuse. This is really where the word genocide for Indigenous people really plays in. And I have 3 children. For all of you who have children, how would it feel? How would you feel if the RCMP, an Indian agent, myself, or someone came into your home and took your children? You weren't allowed to see them or visit them. You know that they were being sexually abused, physically abused. You know that their cultural identity was being stripped away. Your family identity was being stripped away. How would you feel? How would you react? How would you even heal from that? Over 6,500 unmarked graves have been found at residential schools throughout Canada right now, and they're still continuing to find them. Our people have known that they're there. We've been telling everyone for all these years. We've known about our brothers, our sisters, our aunts, our uncles, our grandmothers. Those are our relations that we lost. But now the truth is coming out about the residential school system. Everyone has their own stories about residential schools. I know I have mine. I'm going to keep that to myself today. Very emotional about it, and it's hard for me to talk about. The 60 scoop. The 60 scoop was coined by Patrick Johnson. He was the author of the 1983 report, Native Children on the Child Welfare System. Basically, the 60 scoop refers to the mass removal of the Indigenous children from their families and put into the child welfare system. In most cases, this was without consent of their families, the communities, their bands. In 1983, the report explored the mass apprehension of Indigenous children from their homes and reserves and put into the welfare system. The social workers would go into the communities, into the homes, and literally scoop up the children from the reserves with the slightest pretext. This scooping dramatically accelerated over the representation of Indigenous children in welfare systems. Now, the MMIW&G, Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, in September 2016, the Government of Canada launched an entire independent national inquiry into the missing murdered Indigenous women. In June 2019, they released their final report, Findings Persistent and Deliberate Human and Indigenous Rights Violations and Abuses are Root Causes Behind Canada's Staggering Rates of Violence Against Indigenous Women, Girls, 2S LGBTQIA people. Indigenous women face life-threatening gender-based violence and disproportionately experience violent crimes because of the hatred and racism. I do want to bring to note the Women's Association of Ontario are the ones who currently are keeping the updated statistics and are still very much a big part of this of advocacy for the MMIWG. They do fantastic work. If you're looking for more information, I encourage you to check out their website. Now, something new that's really coming to light lately is the birth alert. And the birth alert was a practice of child welfare agencies or social workers notifying a hospital and birth centers of safety concerns before the baby was born. So a birth alert is when a social worker flags an expectant parent to hospital staff without the parent's consent. because they believe the unborn baby is at risk. Hospital staff are expected to let a social worker know once a baby is born. It is a practice that can result in the child being taken from their parents and does approximately 28% of the time, at least in BC, according to the government records published by Indigi News in January. So this is something that's coming to light. It's a national litigation effort going on right now. It's another colonial tactic. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. But this continues to be part of the whole history of Canada and its relationship with Indigenous people. I want to talk about the child welfare system. I consider, again, my opinion, I consider this oppressive legislation. We are the only people on Turtle Island that do not manage themselves or their own affairs. The government of Canada still looks down upon us as the Indian problem. It is thus that we are less than, and they belittle us, and that we are incapable of taking care of ourselves or managing our own affairs. And in Canada, 52.2% of the children in foster care are Indigenous, but account only for 7.7% of the child population, according to our Canada Census in 2016. This means almost 15,000 out of 28,665 foster children in private homes are Indigenous. Now I want to talk about epistemicide. UC Santa Cruz defines epistemology as the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief and opinion. Britannica defines this as a philosophical study of the nature of origin and its limits on human knowledge. Wikipedia defines this as a destruction of existing knowledge, destruction of existing knowledge. It is used with the context of colonialism. It is a form of cultural genocide. Now, axiology is the quantifying in value or worth. This is the worth of the land. This is the worth of the people. And as you could see, for the last 154 years of Canada's relationships with Indigenous people, we are not valued. Colonialism is based on those values and is very interconnected with epistemicide. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, it defines it as the person has been exposed to a traumatic event in which the following have been present. The person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to physical integrity of themselves or others. Second is the person's response involves intense fear, helplessness, or horror. In order to expand this definition, alternative types of trauma have been put forward by researchers. That includes intergenerational trauma, race-based insidious trauma. The common thread amongst these theories is that historical factors interact with current day stressors and can result in either problematic or resilient outcomes in individuals, families, and communities. Historical trauma, we see the impacts of colonization, institutionalization through the residential school system. It is just one example of that historical trauma, but is probably the most prevalent for today's discussion, being National Truth and Reconciliation Day. Historical trauma can have significant impacts on the psychological and physical health of an individual. Now, inter or transgenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma has been passed on through generations. Today, it is embedded in the very fabric of some communities. Colonizers first created the harm and compounded the trauma by outlawing our Indigenous cultures and practices that could heal us, heal the harm that was done. Intergenerational trauma gets passed down from those who directly experience an incident and subsequent generations. The root cause of a lot of these issues that you see out here, incarceration, health issues, suicide, addictions, parenting issue, all of that was stripped away from residential schools. We lost our self-worth, our self-identity. We lost our culture, our language. We lost our family. So we lost our parenting skills. The root cause for a lot of this trauma is intergenerational trauma. Either our parents went through this, our grandparents went through this, either ourselves directly went through this, whoever it may be, we know it's going to take at least 7 generations for the healing to begin or to occur. So that was the truth of the 154-year plus history with the Canadian government and Indigenous people. Now let's look forward. Let's move forward in a positive way. What is that Orange Shirt Day about? It is to recognize that over 150,000 children who endured the residential school system and its trauma that continues to be felt to this day. We encourage all of you to research more about this history and read Phyllis's Webstad's story, watch her videos, but learn more information about Orange Shirt Day and the residential school legacy. It can be found at orangeshirtday.org and it can be found at reconciliationcanada.ca. And this Orange Shirt Day is a movement that comes from Phyllis Webstad. Phyllis is from the Shuswap area. She's from the Sitsikwickum-Excadam First Nation. Her family lived modestly, and she was very proud. Her grandmother got her an orange shirt. She was proud to go to residential school, thinking it would be excited. It would be a good time. First thing that happened to her in her residential school experience is that her orange shirt was stripped off her back. And that's begun her residential school experiences. And this is where that movement or that saying, every child matters, comes from now. I want to talk about reconciliation. And reconciliation is defined by the Truth Reconciliation Commission, is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in this country. And the Truth Reconciliation Commission came about as a result of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. The Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair, Dr. Murray Wilson, Chief Wilton Littlechild, Grand Chief Wilton Littlechild were tasked to put together this commission, and it was really to inform, their mandate was to inform other people, all Canadians, everyone around the world, about the truth about the residential school and the residential school legacy. The goal was to guide and inspire Indigenous peoples, Canadians, and the world in a process of renewed relationships of reconciliation. I'm proud to call all three my friends, including one of them is my cousin. So they are our mentors. I have the utmost respect for those three and what they did for all Indigenous people. To have reconciliation, you have to have some forgiveness. And I want to talk about that forgiveness. Forgiveness is the principal decision to give up your justified right for revenge. It also requires the forgiver to recognize that the offender is human like myself. There's two types of forgiveness, and this is unilateral forgiveness and bilateral forgiveness. The unilateral forgiveness requires nothing in return. Bilateral forgiveness involves an exchange. It is that contractual relationship between people groups dependent on apology and remorse. It is often tied with justice as it involves with paying of a social debt. Now, key points about forgiveness. There's process, recognition, empathy, and reconciliation. The process of forgiveness is not a single magnanimous gesture in response to an isolated offense, but a longer-term, fluid, and ever-changing process where people work towards repairing broken relationships or broken hearts. Recognition is forgiveness is about recognizing that life is messy, unpredictable, and that we are fallible human beings capable of messing up. It requires a broad perspective. Empathy, forgiveness is more than just accepting or letting go because it requires a degree of empathy or compassion. It is the ability to place yourself in someone else's life, empathy, to act accordingly to the empathetic connection you feel towards your fellow human beings, hopefully compassion. Reconciliation. Forgiveness is different from reconciliation, which requires some kind of peace process and the coming together in unity of two or more formerly hostile sides. Now, the reconciliation framework can be seen as a 5-step process, including developing a shared vision of an interdependent and fair society, acknowledging and dealing with the past, building positive relationships, and facilitating significant cultural and attitudinal change. And the 5th step is enabling substantial social, economical, and political change. And remember, reconciliation refers to the restoration of the fractured relationships by overcoming grief, pain, and anger. Now, I want to start off by saying, what can you do? Remember, I asked you what reconciliation meant to you. I still pose that question to you. What does reconciliation mean to you? I always ask, where do you want to be in this space? Do you want to have a relationship with Indigenous people? What does that look like? What does that look like for your company or organization? Do you want to have a relationship? Do you want to be a leader in this space or in the middle of the pack or skimming by? No matter what, we need that community behind us. If it's the organizations, if it's a series, multiple employers, multiple communities, yes, we need a community behind us. But reconciliation starts with you, starts with me. We are the difference makers. We have to own that relationship, our actions. Reconciliation is not a destination, it is a journey. For Indigenous people, what other choice do we have? There is no other choice for Indigenous people. Just want you to think about that. But the journey of reconciliation starts with one, to respect, to recognize, to acknowledge the truths, and to be accountable. It begins with me. To move forward, or to heal, to rectify, to be the change, and to move forward in that positive way. Now, I was going to say, this is more about a mindset and tangible actions. The purpose and intent behind today is not just treating it as a day off, as a national holiday for truth and reconciliation and taking it as a day off. It's just like Family Day. You want to go spend the time with your family. Today's National Truth and Reconciliation Day is a mindset and has that purpose of intent behind today of that tangible action. What are you doing to begin your journey of reconciliation? And to me, you could do a couple things. And that is a personal pledge of reconciliation. Or your company, your organization can take a pledge. I want to talk about some personal pledges that you can take upon yourself today. And that is, educate yourself on Indigenous foundational knowledge. Educate yourself on residential schools, its legacies, and its impacts. That to me is what today is really all about. Remembering the residential school survivors and those children who did not make it home, and the impacts that it's had on their families, on the communities. Volunteer at an Indigenous organizations. Support Indigenous artisans, either crafts, artisans, musicians. Try attend these cultural events. We have a lot of social ceremonies such as round dances and powwows. Please feel free to attend, start building those relationships, start learning about Indigenous people and our way of life. Listen to Indigenous artists, and there's lots of ways to do. We have musicians, we have podcasts, we have Red Talks. Explore authentically Indigenous experience. We have plenty of cultural camps throughout Canada. There's a lot of B&Bs. There's a lot of museums, family-owned businesses that specialize in these culturally authentic experiences. Watch films, documentaries, webinars, read books. To me, reconciliation is about education and awareness and how we move forward together. Be an ally. I provide a lot of cultural services for a lot of organizations throughout the city of Calgary here. And one thing I always say culturally to everyone when I have people in the sweat is, why is it so hard to be kind to one another today? Today's society, you go out, you see a liquor store at every corner, you see now marijuana business in every community or every corner. We have gossip, we have greed, social media makes that so easy, Facebook. It is so easy to be negative and bring negativity into your life. Our culture, our values, our traditions we're taught fundamentally to love one another and to be kind to one another. Why is that so hard today in today's society to be kind? So take a personal pledge. Just be kind to people moving forward. I'll give a quick cultural teaching. Our pipe that I use, I follow the Makpiaskawi, the white buffalo calf pipe, or Chief Orville Looking Horse is our pipe keeper. He has that original pipe that was brought to us, but that pipe bowl, the pipe that he has, that bowl is red, and what it signifies is that we all bleed red, is that we are all equal. There is no one higher than us, and there is no one below us. We do not put people on pedestals, and we do not talk down and belittle people. We are all equal. And this is where we get that prayer or saying to say that we are all related. And this is why that unconditional love is at the forefront of our cultural ways. And this is why we do it. And this is why we are kind to one another. But these are just acts of personal pledges that you can do. Here are 10 examples of professional pledges you or your organization can do. Hire Indigenous talent, hire and train Indigenous students, put a student hiring program in place. You can provide Indigenous awareness training and or Indigenous cultural sensitivity training. You can continue to build respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples where you live, work, and play. You can challenge the stereotypes and misconceptions about Indigenous peoples of Canada. You can support the economic reconciliation, celebrate and participate in Indigenous events such as National Indigenous Peoples Day, Orange Shirt Day, or National Truth and Reconciliation Day, craft fairs, etc., etc. You could read and honor the TRC's Truth Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action and UNDRIP, and you could learn more about the foundational knowledge with and from Indigenous peoples. Encourage and inspire others to participate in reconciliation. Be an ally. So I quickly wanted to talk and share with you about Eco Canada and what we are doing to support reconciliation. Over the summer, the last few months, we had a junior office clerks program, and you can see the picture of them. They are the children of our eco staff employees. They were phenomenal, and what we came together is that we would hold a concession for fundraising, and that we wanted to have an orange shirt design contest. And this is what we are proudly wearing today. And we were going to sell the t-shirts, and we are donating all the proceeds going to the Awatan Healing Lodge Society. It's a woman emergency shelter here in Calgary. The Awatan Emergency Shelter, a lot of the clients are experienced or have felt the effects of the residential school fallout and all the trauma. A lot of their clients are residential school survivors or families of their parents or grandparents have experienced residential schools. So this was a way for Eco Canada to give back and to be an ally and show that support and to help with the reconciliation efforts. And this is our reconciliation pledge tree that's sitting up in our kitchen at our office. And what we are doing is that we are sending in our pledges, our personal pledges. Every one of us as employees, if we wanted to share our pledges, we're sending them in and we're putting our pledges up there to show what we are doing with at Eco Canada in regards to reconciliation. So now I'd like to look back and do some reflection. What does what does the word reconciliation mean to you now? What will you do to raise awareness about not only Orange Shirt Day, but National Truth and Reconciliation Day moving forward? Why do you think it's important to work and build upon the relationships? And what is your reconciliation pledge? So with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation. If anyone has any questions about the presentation, about the history, about the Truth Reconciliation Commission, I'll be more than glad to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you, Brad, for the really wonderful presentation. For those of you who are interested in asking questions, you can submit in the chat box, or there's also a question box as well. Brad, I have our first question that's come in, and they're asking, what actions towards reconciliation would you consider especially important for students in environmental science programs?
To me, is understanding how Indigenous traditional knowledge plays a role in the environmental sciences. We know that Western society has their educational program, what they teach us in post-secondary, but how is traditional knowledge incorporated into that? And I would start off by wherever you are attending school at the moment, is I would encourage you to go and start building that relationship with the Indigenous Student Center or Native Student Center. If you're here in Calgary, we have the Inikokan centers at the University, Mount Royal University, U of C, and I know SAIT has an Indigenous center there as well. I would go there and I would start building that relationship, talking to some of not only your fellow students, but a lot of the elders from the community attend there. And that is where I'd start getting that type of information. I would definitely start researching how our traditional knowledge plays a role in the environmental sciences.
Thanks, Brad. I've got a couple more that have come in here. Someone has shared their pledge, and I thought I'd read it out. It says, I will educate myself, get out of my comfort zone, and learn more about the Indigenous community.
It's fantastic. And like I said, this is a question that we all have to ask ourselves is, where do we want to be in this space? What does reconciliation look for us? What does that relationship look for us? And the more people that we have educating themselves, being open-minded to new relationships, future relationships, this is how we become a harmonious society and build reconciliation. So.
Thanks, Brad. We have another question. We've still got about 6 minutes here. Someone mentioned that they saw a slide with black, white, yellow, and red colors, and they're asking what these colors represent.
That's traditionally, that's our medicine wheel colors, and it's interpreted in different ways. There's 4 quadrants. The number 4 is very special to, significant to Indigenous people. To me, I follow a Lakota Sioux, Woktahachiushpai. This is where I get all my teachings from. The black is to the west. This is where the thunder, the lightning, the keeper of the ways come from. The red is to the north. the yellow is to the east, the white is to the south. And it's easier for me to speak more in Sioux on this because it's a different, and you lose a lot in the English translation. And weak peata ki io a sapa wazea pata ki io a luta wioia pata ki io a ri e tontaga pata ki io a ska. What I was basically saying, there are stones, doctors, realms in each of those doorways. And I just acknowledged all of those. It's interesting to note that is a Sioux Mi'kmaq. A lot of people use black, red, yellow, white. To the Cree, and I'm Cree from Saddle Lake, we do not use the black. We use blue. It goes blue, red, yellow, white. So it depends where you're from, who you're building that relationship with. But those are our four sacred colors, or our medicine wheel that we use. It gets so complex, our medicine wheel's teachings, and it's very interpretive. There's a lot of different interpretation and meanings to it depending on who you talk to, who you build that relationship with. But that's fundamentally what it is.
That's very informative. Thank you, Brad. We have another question here. So someone is asking, many of our field books are lacking traditional knowledge of the plants, animals, and other organisms. Are there known field books that we can get, or is there any way to help create these?
Excellent question. I do know of a couple books. I don't know the context information of I could get you that information. So if that individual would like to email me, you see my email up on the screen right now. Please feel free to shoot me that email and I will follow it up with you with those books, with the appropriate books and information. There are books on plants, medicines, herbs, but to get them incorporated into educational books, that's more of that post-secondary institution and their commitment. And that is exactly what I was saying, is where does traditional knowledge play a part in environmental sciences?
Definitely, that makes sense, Brad. Another few questions here. Do you think pop culture and Hollywood needs to change how it portrays Indigenous culture?
It's funny, years ago, we were just having this discussion years ago in Hollywood, all the movies about Indigenous people were non-Indigenous actors. Going back to about the 60s to the 90s, there was only 3, 4 actors, Indigenous actors really identified. Now today, though, we see a lot more Indigenous actors, a lot more Indigenous-owned productions. Perfect example is Reservation Dogs out there right now. We're seeing more and more authentic and truly Indigenous people breaking into different streams, including Hollywood. I would say, I think the days of tokenism, the days of not being authentic, being genuine, I I think those days have come to an end. We need to be genuine, authentic moving forward. And I see that. So I think it is changing.
That's great to hear. We'll do one last question before we wrap up this session. Someone is asking, is there a reason that Truth and Reconciliation Day is on the same day as Orange Shirt Day? Why isn't Truth and Reconciliation Day its own day?
It ties into the residential school legacy and its impacts. Orange Shirt Day, like we said, is that Indigenous-led movement that comes from Phyllis Webster's story and her experiences, and it just grew from there. Having said that, that truth reconciliation National Truth Reconciliation Day is about that commemoration, the remembrance of the residential school survivors and that residential school legacy and its impacts that it's had. So they go hand in hand. So they complement each other well. But that is what the government of Canada has chosen to do, and we're supporting, following suit.
Thanks, Brad. Well, to wrap things up, I want to say a tremendous thank you to Brad for sharing all of his insight and knowledge on important ways to help us move forward. And I want to thank you, everyone who attended as well. We really appreciate you attending. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out a short survey. We also encourage you to take a look at eco.ca for upcoming events and to join us again. Thank you, everyone.